Okay, so if you weren't on the call last week, I announced that we were going to be starting a series. I don't know how long it'll last, on life, death, and dying. And I talked about the reason for it was that I had a meditation counseling session with someone who had lost someone recently. And as we were talking and getting deeper into it, and what our tradition in the Semitic tradition talks about, and the Vedic tradition talks about dealing with these things, and how meditation is a very important piece of that puzzle. Afterwards, I thought, well, this is something that might be good to talk about in this group, because some of us are getting older, and everyone, even if we're younger, is affected by these things. So what I said last week was, we can't look at death and dying without looking at life, because life is the other side of it. And in this Kabbalistic Semitic tradition, we have what's called the double letters, which most of you are familiar with. And the double letters exemplify the opposites, right? Peace and war, for example, right? And in this case, life and death. So the double letter, the first double letter, being Bet, is the energy of both life and death, because it is the first letter of the energy of the world of creation. So, as you know, this in our tradition, you know, the way it's taught is that there are four worlds: the world of emanation, the world of creation, the world of formation, and the world of action. So really what happens is there's divine, pure consciousness that's without end, without beginning and without end. And it's always emanating, like bubbles, effervescent bubbles in 7-Up, right? That energy is always emanating. And then, from some desire, it became creation, which became form, which became action. It's very logical, because this is what we see in nature. And if you're a physicist, you can say, yes, this is what happens. From a unified field, there's vibration, and that vibration becomes creation and form, and it acts like that. So we talked about Bet, and we talked about a little bit about that concept of how, and that's always going on in life. It's not something that happened a zillion years ago, and then we're just living with the consequence of it. So I asked you if you had the time to maybe read Genesis, called in Hebrew, we call Bereshit, which means the beginning, is just to read the first, second chapter like that, to get an idea of where this is all coming from. So I can tell you why, and sort of give you a format of this beginning, or this platform that we're using to talk about these things. But over the course of many Sundays, I hope that we'll really get into the practical things that not only our tradition, but the Vedic tradition and other traditions tell us about dealing with life and dealing with death and dying in a very practical way, not just a theosophical way. So when we look at Genesis, we can look at it from two perspectives, right? More than a million perspectives, but two main perspectives being that, is this a historical event? You know, sometime back thousands of years ago? Or is this just allegory? Or both, right? So when we look at things, whatever, we're looking at the Veda or the Mahabharata in the Veda, and we're looking at Buddhism or Christianity or Judaism, we're going to say there's lots of theosophical stuff that we don't have empirical evidence of. So we need to accept that those are maybes, right? However much we might believe it, we have to accept that those are, I believe it, maybe, and it may be true. And then there's the allegory that relate to how we live and how we cope and what we do with this teaching, right? So if we look at it as allegory, then we can take a deep dive into how does this relate to my experience in life and my experience with death and dying? And that's what we want to do. So we're not going to invalidate anyone's ideas of how the world was created or creation or dying or what happens after death. We're going to talk about all those things over the course of Sundays. But we'll know that the theosophical side of that is a maybe. But when we get into our experiences and how those teachings can possibly help us deal with our life experiences and our death experiences, that's what the goal is here. We learn further as we take a deeper dive into the sages' discussions on this matter, right? And the Sefer Yetzirah and the Kabbalistic literature. It's clear that this is all a divine, the expression of divine plan, right? So this notion of right and wrong is challenged, since everything is coming from divine pure consciousness, everything. And the Sefer Yetzirah tells us that all of these things that are called good or evil, the knowledge of the tree of good or evil, all emanate, all come from the divine and the divine desire, right? So if we look at it on the surface, it doesn't make much sense. I mean, if you just read it like, say, there's something wrong, with the author here, because it's just, God creates Adam, and he's an adult already. And as an adult, he puts him in this situation where he says, you can eat, there's a whole bunch of trees here, and you can eat from these trees, but don't eat from this one particular one. And you really get deeper into the Talmudic stuff and the oral tradition. They say he only had not to eat from it for 3 hours. And then Shabbat would come, and then everything would be perfect forever and ever if nobody ate from it. And of course, he's Eve, this has this dialogue with a serpent, and the serpent says, oh, come on, don't worry about it. Eat from the tree. She eats from the tree. And now they know they're naked, right? And God's looking for them, and they're hiding. So it's really kind of a very strange story. If we think of God in terms of not just being like a human where people can hide from him and stuff, right? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So if we look at it for a moment from the idea that this is sort of allegory about who we are and what we are and how we live and our choices and life and how it shows up with us, to us, it becomes, I think, personally, far more interesting, right? So we can look at it from the point of view of allegory as we're looking at it with what the sages are saying about it as well. So the divine plan was put into action and is put into action always. And all of these things that we think of, Sefer Yetzirah sort of dispels as, this idea that there's a God and then there's a Satan, and Satan works against God, and God, puts up with Satan for whatever reasons. And like that, Satan caused the fall of man, and God never wanted it that way. Sefer Yetzirah says basically, this is all the will of God. So it's all the will of this divine consciousness becoming, and it's becoming right now as we are sitting here and standing here. So to begin with this platform, I just wanted to read. I'll read from the Torah itself, and I'll also read a little bit from the Zohar, and then maybe you can think about it for a moment and have some response to it. Okay, so in the Torah, as many of you know, we talked about Bet. And as I said, Bet is the first letter in the Torah, and it's the first energy of this world of creation. So we talk about the mother letters being most primordial energy sounds. And in this case, we're beyond that into actually the world of creation, beyond the emanating pure consciousness. So the first sentence in the Torah is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, which in English means, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So this is the beginning of the world of creation, Bria. And Bria simply means creation. So what is this Bet? This Bet is creating space. So if God is everywhere and all, and divine consciousness and pure consciousness everywhere and all, a space needs to be created. And the purpose of that space and the purpose of creation is so that the absolute pure divine can be known. So that is what is in the Semitic tradition. It's both in Lurianic Kabbalism and Abulufian Kabbalism. So that divine, pure bliss consciousness can be known, this space is created. So this is critical in understanding purpose. So I'm going to read from the Zohar. Hopefully my space thing that I made the space for is still here. Okay, good. So I'm just going to read a few sentences, and I don't want this to become a crazy theosophical class, because there's a lot here about the first chapter in the Zohar, obviously. It's talking about a point, the point where creation begins, the world of creation. Beyond that point, there is no knowable, and therefore it is called Bereshit, beginning. The creative utterance is the starting point of all of creation. Okay, so here's another clue. As we read further in Genesis, it says, and God said, let there be light. So there is a creative utterance. Utterance, the word for utterance in the Torah is he said, means to articulate. And it's Omer or Omer. Okay. He said, Vav Aleph Mem Resh. So what that indicates is Vav is this connector, and the Aleph, of course, is that pure silence of which we speak, that becomes the breath, the divine breath. Sefer Yetzirah says, holy breath from breath, water from breath. Mem, in this speaking, represents the water. So you have the Aleph, the air, and the water in creation. So the word in Genesis, in the Hebrew word for God, and there's multiple different words in the Torah that represent the energy of divine. In this case, it's Elohim. So that's in the world of creation, that's the creative force, the energy of those letters, Elohim, which is Aleph, not surprisingly, because we're saying that it's emanating from Ein Sof, or pure consciousness. Right? Then the connector Lamed, Hey Yud Mem, Elohim. Elohim shows up 32 times in the first chapter of Genesis. Shloshim v'shtayim netivot pliot, 32 times, 32 paths of mystical consciousness, right? So this is another hint. Elohim shows up 32 times in the first chapter of Genesis. Sefer Yetzirah says there are 32 paths of higher consciousness related to the 10 branches or 10 sephira of the tree of life and the 22 sound vibrations that we call the Hebrew letters. So God articulates. So there is space, this bet is the space. The Zohar calls the palace that contains the divine and enables those beings that have a soul to experience the divine. So this palace or this space or this life allows us to experience divine consciousness. So a little more from the Zohar. There was indeed a brightness, the most mysterious, struck its void. So there was a void, this mysterious Ein Sof struck its void itself and caused this point, this beginning to shine. Then extended and made for itself a palace for its honor and glory. Made for itself a palace. So this container that is this palace is created by the movement of this energy, these vibrations, the sound, and all of the palace that is all of creation contains the divine and enables us to experience it. So by virtue of the palace that is our bodies, because there's the macro and the micro, and our nervous system and who we are enables us to experience that which is divine within ourselves, right? That's the essence of the life that we're talking about in Bereshit. Then we go further, and there's this game that's articulated here in the garden, right? With these trees. Now it's said in the Zohar and other places that the tree of life is in the center of the garden. And its waters come from supernal, the divine pure consciousness. And this tree of life gives life. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was on the side. So there's an idea of an imbalance and lopsidedness. Why would the knowledge of good and evil be a bad thing? If you just look at the story on the surface, a curse is given to three people, or one kind of person, who's a serpent, Eve and then Adam, right, for eating of this tree. And the word curse is used in the Torah. So one would, if you just read it on the surface, one would assume this was a bad thing, right? No. So I'm going to say that in general, the Kabbalists believe it wasn't a bad thing and that it was a plan. It was a divine plan. And the reason given is that it was necessary in this process, once the palace was made, for those that are the palace and in the palace to experience divine consciousness, it's necessary for us to struggle. It's sort of like the old adage, right? If somebody gives you something without you doing anything for it, you don't appreciate it, right? So the adage is, in order to experience this garden and the flow of the tree of life, it's necessary to choose it. It's necessary to have the struggle of life and death in the cycle of life and death in order to experience that which transcends the struggle. When we talk about Bereshit, and we talk about the beginning, and we talk about love, and we talk about one, the gematria to echad and love, and if we use small gematria in terms of our calculating, is all 13. It all comes together with 13. And there's a lot in that. Then talked about 32 and 13. The numerology of this is unescapable when you get into it in Genesis. In Abulufi and Kabbalism, we have the Sefer Yetzirah, we have Shir HaShirim, and we have Genesis as the foundation of Abulufi and Kabbalism. So looking at this is really the history of the holy tradition of this meditation that we do. In terms of the movement of energy, death comes into the picture, not in Genesis 1, but it creeps in 2 and then is there in Genesis 3. And it's related to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It only comes into play as a result of taking from that tree. So concluding, I want to say, what is it about the knowledge of good and evil? What it is the balance that we're talking about comes from order. And order requires chakmah, the flow of the tree of life from the supernal waters, requires the experience of wisdom before the understanding of knowledge of good and evil. So what happens? They become ashamed of being naked. That's one of the first results. And God says, what do you mean? How do you know you're naked? So the knowledge of being naked would not make you ashamed if there was Hakma consciousness. You see, if the tree of life and the supernal waters are flowing freely and your consciousness is full of light, why would you be ashamed of anything? I mean, the seed of being ashamed is watered by ignorance, not enlightenment. Believe me, please, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we should go around trying to be naked in front of each other or anything like that. I'm just talking about, let's look deeply at what happened so we understand your enlightened life. And the tree of life allows us to live forever. What does that mean? So that's something I'd like you to ponder, and we can talk about next week. And if you get a chance, look at Kohelet, which is Ecclesiastes, right? The first chapter or two. And we could sort of bring this, now we're going to bring this from a very theosophical conversation into a very practical way of life. But in order to do that, we sort of have to cut off these rigid judgmental narratives we have. We're not going to cover every possible theosophical tradition. We're not even going to cover every theosophical position in the Semitic tradition. It would take 80 years to do that. But what I want to do is start cutting these strings a little bit and letting us look at these practical ways, how this all is happening all the time, every day in our lives. Life and death is taking place. And when the big moments of life and death take place, we're better able to understand them and experience them without fear or without so much fear.